Now available in paperback and e-readers. E-Steam Horror of the Hyena Woman. Hell's aspiring angel takes on a wicked werewolf in this action-packed all-new E-Steam series adventure. Get E-Steam Horror of the Hyena Woman in paperback and e-readers today. Villains have always been a weak point for the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Now, the Marvel Cinematic Universe has really great, compelling stories. However, they don't really have solid antagonists to drive their stories. In the first couple of MCU movies, Iron Man, The Incredible Hulk, and Captain America, the First Avenger, they did start out with some decent antagonists in Obadiah Stane, the Red Skull, and the Abomination. However, ever since those three movies, we really started to see a decline in the bad guys in MCU movies. Now, having a weak villain in your movie can really mess it up because you really need a bad guy to drive the story in a character-driven story because the bad guy is the one driving the conflict. Unfortunately, most MCU movies don't really do a good job of developing their villains, and that leads to a very, very mild experience as related to the overall superhero movie. Because in a superhero movie, you do need a bad guy so that the hero can overcome, and you need a bad guy so that the hero can go out here and show why good triumphs over evil. Unfortunately, when you're watching an MCU movie, it's so much about the hero that you don't really get a villain that is a strong antagonist that allows you to see why the hero is needed and why the hero is important. Now, when I look at many of these MCU villains that people like to say are the best villains, like Loki and Thanos, they are extremely weak when I compare them to villains of other classic movies like Dick Jones and Clarence Boddicker from RoboCop, like Bennett from Commando, and like the boss in Tango and Cash, and many other villains that I grew up watching during the 1980s. Now, during the 1980s, characters like your Clarence Boddicker and Dick Jones clearly showed us how evil they were by their actions, and these villains were so compelling on screen that you practically could never forget them because of how evil they were, and they were so evil that they practically became larger than life characters that were just as memorable as the heroes in movies like RoboCop, Commando, and Tango and Cash. And a good villain they just pop off the screen and just make you love to hate them. And we've never been able to love to hate a bad guy in the Marvel Cinematic Universe because oftentimes MCU screenwriters go out here and write these, what they call sympathetic villains. Now, I find the whole concept of a sympathetic villain to be something that's really wrong-headed because we are not supposed to sympathize with the bad guys. No, we are supposed to see the bad guys as an enemy that needs to be defeated by the hero, because when you have a sympathetic bad guy, what that does is it weakens the mission of the hero, and it makes it where we don't really see the hero as the main focus of the story. Because when you have a sympathetic bad guy, it really just makes it where you take away from the hero's story and you take away from the hero's journey. I don't want to go out here and sympathize with bad guys, especially ones like a Loki and especially a Thanos, because this really blurs the line between good and evil. And what it does is it makes it where you start to have ethical conundrums as related to heroics. Because when you have people sympathizing and saying, I understand Thanos, what that says is that there's a real serious ethical issue, because what your Thanos wanted to do was utterly reprehensible. And to say you sympathize with this bad guy, there's something wrong with our society, because we're not supposed to sympathize with villains. No, villains are reprehensible human beings, and we're not supposed to want to identify or relate with them, because when you're sympathizing with a bad guy, you're saying, okay, what he's doing is somewhat right, but there is nothing right about what they're doing at all. And this is one of the issues I had with Avengers Endgame, was the complete compromise of ethics, because the heroes went and stooped to Thanos' level by going and participating in time travel to make their own Infinity Gauntlet. And that was unethical as I saw it, because the hero is not supposed to go to the villain's level. No, the hero is supposed to show us that we can rise above the unethical behaviors of the bad guy. And this is where the lines again got blurred with Infinity War and Avengers Endgame, that showed us that your attempts to make a sympathetic bad guy were making it where we were losing the definition of a hero. And the reason why we lost the definition of a hero in the MCU is because there was never a clear definition of the villains. The villains never really showed us that they were evil. They never showed us that they were, why they were a real serious threat. And that is due to the weak writing of many of these MCU movies, that yes, they show you great heroes out here with showcasing their powers and their abilities, but they don't really show us the character development and character growth that a good antagonist would bring out, like in Sam Raimi's 2002 Spider-Man. Now, in Sam Raimi's 2002 Spider-Man, we saw that Norman Osborn clearly was an unethical and evil person, who was in contrast to Peter Parker, who was just a young kid who was out here. He got these powers, but then he realized what responsibility he had to others after his Uncle Ben wound up dying at the hands of the burglar. Now, your Peter Parker was starting on the same road of being as unethical as Norman Osborn, as he was starting to showcase his powers and didn't do anything about the burglar. He thought it was just all about him getting what he wanted. But when he realized what he had lost, that he started to realize there was an ethical line, and he started to realize that everything Uncle Ben had taught him had value. And him trying to preserve the values of Uncle Ben was the thing that made him a hero, in addition to wanting to honor his uncle's loss by making sure that nobody else suffered what he lost. So when I look at 2002 Spider-Man, you clearly have a hero, and your Norman Osborn clearly shows us that he is a villain, and he's a villain who was one of the most compelling villains of the early 2000s superhero movies, because he was a clearly defined bad guy. We did not sympathize with him. Yes, we understood that he was a greedy and an unethical person, but we understood that this was an evil person who went out here and did great evil, and Peter Parker had a great responsibility to stop him from hurting other people. So that's what we got from 2002 Spider-Man. We got a clear line of good and evil, and we got to see that there was an ethical line. That's something we don't get with the MCU, which really, again, doesn't do a good job of showing us what a threat the bad guys are. No, they just put heroes on the screen, but they don't really do a good job of developing their villains. This is something that I see in a lot of indie comics from first-time creators. They go out here and they would go out here and create this great hero with all of these great powers, but they never put a good antagonist in their comics, and their comics suffer as a result. This is something that I had to learn about when I was starting to learn how to write comics and fantasy, that I needed strong bad guys in order to drive the story, because a character having great powers is is one thing, but having a greater antagonist is another, and your MCU doesn't understand the work of making a truly great bad guy, one that pops off the screen and is memorable for years, like your Clarence Boddicker from RoboCop. I can still remember how many of the evil deeds he did, like taking out Murphy inside of the steel mill, and I can remember, Dick Jones just not caring about the 209, shooting up the employee, and I can definitely remember your Bennett and all the evil stuff he did, and I can remember the payback that Bennett got when Matrix threw the pipe through his chest and told him to let off some steam. And those are the kind of moments that are missing from MCU movies. You don't really get that big payoff for watching the movie. You never really get to see the bad guy really get that big comeuppance. You never really see the bad guy really get it the way you do in other classic films, and that really takes away from the entire experience of the movie. You don't really get to see the bad guys really get punished for the evil deeds that they do in a grand and glorious fashion that shows us evil doesn't pay. I mean, Ironmonger and Iron Man, that was a very anticlimactic, and same thing with the Red Skull and the Abomination. That was also, again, kind of a weak sauce ending, and that's a big problem with many MCU movies. You never get the big payoff where you see the bad guy really get what he deserves and really suffer for all of the suffering he gives people. You really don't get to see the bad guys really pay for all of the evil things that they do, and that's what makes your MCU bad guys really weak in comparison to other cinematic villains. And when I look at the MCU, a lot of people want to say, oh, they have really good bad guys. No, if you've really sat down and watched older films like Commando, RoboCop, Tango and Cash, Total Recall, Speed, if you watch any of those films, you will see truly compelling villains who are rich and multi-dimensional, villains that can command the screen, villains that have their own story, and villains that are well developed and are not just a plot device like many of these MCU villains, which are basically cut and pasted into the movie and just there for the sake of being there and having only a purpose of basically just moving the film to the next MCU movie. So when I look at the MCU's villains compared to other villains, they just don't really rank up as memorable. They really don't rank up as strong. And when you go out here and you just look at them, they just really are not really that interesting at all. I mean, when I look at MCU villains, they are the weakest villains. And yes, this franchise is popular, but the villains are not the reason why the franchise is popular. And these movies could be far better and far memorable if they just had a good bad guy to drive their stories. Now, if you want to see me make more comic and sci-fi and fantasy related videos, you can donate to my Patreon, my PayPal, or my Cash App by clicking the links in the description box. And if you want to pick up some of my action-packed fantasy fiction on the SJS Direct imprint, like the ISIS series, the E-Steam series, the John Haynes series, and the books of the Spinsterella trilogy, you can find those books on Amazon.com in paperback and Kindle format. You can also find them on Smashwords, the iBook Store, and Google Play. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe. Now available in paperback and e-readers, ISIS, Revenge of the Cyber Goddess. The goddess next door takes on the threat of a deadly digital diva driven to destroy the world in this action-packed, all-new ISIS series adventure. Get ISIS, Revenge of the Cyber Goddess, featuring a bonus pin-up and the other two books in the Cyber Goddess saga at online booksellers everywhere today.